Her boots were dry, though it rained all night. The dust, usually so eager to cling, seemed to recoil from her, leaving the worn leather untouched, a strange defiance in the otherwise parched land. A subtle hum, not of insects, but of the wind, whispered through the sparse mesquite, carrying with it the scent of distant cedar and a faint metallic tang, a premonition that settled deep in the bones. The sun, still a crimson smear on the eastern horizon, promised another day of unforgiving heat, but the air for now held a peculiar, heavy stillness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and the local time on your side of the prairie. It's always a joy to know how far these old tales travel, and this is how the trail turned bitter. All those years ago, the widow, Alara, moved through her small cabin with a practiced, silent grace. Every object had its place, every movement its purpose. The rhythmic grind of coffee beans, a comforting sound that usually anchored her mornings, felt almost sacrilegious in the profound quiet. She poured the dark liquid into a chipped tin cup, the steam rising like a ghostly breath in the cool pre-dawn air. Her gaze drifted to the single window, a square of smeared glass offering a framed view of the vast, indifferent landscape. The San Juan Mountains, distant and blue, stood sentinel, their jagged peaks often cloaked in early morning mist, a phenomenon the Ute tribes called the Spirit Veil. Today, however, they were stark and clear, unburdened by vapor, revealing every crevice and scar. A faint tremor, barely perceptible, vibrated through the packed earth floor. It was not the ground settling, nor the shift of a sleepy coyote. Alara had lived on this isolated mesa for years, far from the hurried clamor of settlements like dusty Santa Fe or the boom towns that sprang up and withered like desert flowers. She knew the language of the land, the rustle of a garter snake in the dry grass, the hollow thump of a rabbit, the distant howl of a wolf. This tremor was alien, a dissonant note in the morning's symphony. It felt deliberate. She walked to the rough-hewn table, her movements unhurried, yet infused with an unspoken urgency. Her fingers, calloused but nimble, traced the intricate patterns carved into the wooden surface, a gift from her late husband, a frontiersman who had etched his love for the land into everything he touched. He had found peace here, or so he believed, in the quiet solitude, away from the avarice and desperation that gnawed at the edges of civilization. He had often spoken of the hunger for gold that drove men mad, a hunger that had transformed otherwise decent souls into predatory beasts. He swore that the mesa, with its deceptive calm, was impervious to such desires. Alara paused, her hand hovering over a half-eaten biscuit. A flicker of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of her composure. Her husband's faith in the mesa's isolation had been absolute, almost naive. He believed their small, self-sufficient life was a shield against the world's darker currents, but the world, Alara knew, was not so easily deterred. The tremor came again, stronger this time, a subtle reverberation that hummed in her teeth. It was the rhythm of hooves, many hooves, moving at a measured pace. Not a lone rider, not a passing drover. This was a deliberate approach, a formation. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the light outside the window caught her eye. A glint. Metal reflecting the nascent sun. Too low for a passing cloud, too bright for a rock. It was the kind of glint one saw on the barrel of a rifle or a polished stirrup. Her breath hitched, a faint rasp in the quiet cabin. The air, which had been still, now felt charged, heavy with unspoken threat. The moral conflict began to brew within her, to stand and defend the peace her husband had cherished, or to flee into the unforgiving vastness of the desert, abandoning the only home she had known since his passing. This was no passing band of cowboys, no lost prospectors. The way the light caught that metal, the cadence of the approaching thrum, it spoke of intent, malicious intent. She slowly placed the biscuit back on the plate. Her eyes, usually soft with a widow's quiet sorrow, hardened, reflecting a glint that matched the one outside. The silence of the cabin, once comforting, now felt like a taut string, stretched to its breaking point. She had buried her husband on this land, a small cairn of stones marking his final rest. To leave now would be to abandon him, to betray the peace he had fought so hard to cultivate. A sense of protectiveness, fierce and instinctual, rose within her, pushing aside the initial tremor of fear. This was her land, her peace, and no man, no matter how many horses he rode, would take it from her. The desert, unforgiving as it was also her ally. It had taught her patience, resilience, and a quiet, brutal efficiency. The air itself seemed to hum with an approaching discord, a low thrum that vibrated not just the floorboards, but the very silence within the cabin. Alara knew this sound. It was the rhythm of men who believed they were unseen, unheard, their caution a thin veneer over their true, brutish intent. She moved from the window, her gaze sweeping across the small, familiar space. The worn wooden table, the stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly, the rifle resting above the mantelpiece. Each element now took on a heightened significance, a potential tool or a fatal vulnerability. Outside, the sun was clawing its way higher, painting the eastern sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. A thin haze, not of dust, but of unease, seemed to shimmer above the distant scrubland. The Ute people who had traversed these lands for centuries spoke of the shadow wind, a peculiar shift in the air that preceded ill fortune or conflict, a whisper from the spirit's warning of impending trouble. Alara had always dismissed such notions as mere folklore, the romantic imaginings of a people deeply connected to the land. Yet as the metallic tang in the air grew stronger and the cadence of the approaching riders became clearer, she found herself recalling those old tales, a shiver tracing its way up her spine. Her hand went to the small leather-bound book that lay open on the table, a collection of pressed wildflowers her husband had given her years ago. He had meticulously identified each blossom, each delicate petal, and recorded their names in his precise looping script. He saw beauty in the small things, in the resilient life that clung to the harsh desert. His love for this land and for her was etched into every page. And now, men were coming to defile it. A wave of cold fury, sharp and invigorating, washed over her, dispelling the last vestiges of fear. The riders were closer now, the distinct creak of leather and the snort of horses beginning to cut through the stillness. There were at least 5, perhaps 6, she judged, their approach still cautious, but no longer truly hidden. They were probing, testing the silence, anticipating no resistance. They expected a lone widow, perhaps an easy mark, a simple dwelling ripe for the taking. This was a common tale in the West. Isolated homesteads, particularly those belonging to women, were often targeted by desperate men who operated beyond the reach of the distant law. Rumors of hidden gold or forgotten caches of supplies often fueled their journeys into the desolate expanse. Alara knew the land better than any of them. Every arroyo, every stand of prickly pear, every shadowed alcove in the rock formations that dotted the mesa. She knew them intimately. She had walked these trails since her husband's passing, finding solace in the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath her boots. The vast emptiness a mirror to her own quiet grief. But that emptiness was now a weapon, a labyrinth for those who did not understand its subtle treacheries. She moved to the back of the cabin, her movements fluid and silent, like a ripple across still water. The rifle was still on the mantel, but her mind was already calculating, assessing different tools. Her husband had taught her to shoot, patiently guiding her hands, showing her how to sight along the barrel, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. She was a passable shot, certainly, but a rifle, she knew, made noise, and noise in a situation like this could draw more trouble than it solved. The men outside, despite their caution, were relying on the element of surprise, on the shock and fear of a lone woman. But Alara had known fear in its purest form, and it had left her cold and calculating, not paralyzed. A low growl rumbled from beneath the cabin. Old Jack, her scruffy border collie, usually a sentinel, was reacting to the approach. He was loyal, but he was also just a dog, easily subdued by men with guns. She knelt, stroking his matted fur, whispering soothing words. "Quiet now, Jack. Not yet." The dog whined, sensing her tension, but complied, settling back down with a deep sigh. His instinct was to bark, to warn, but Alara needed stealth, not an alarm. She peered through a narrow crack in the wall, a knothole near the dirt floor. Through it, she saw the first rider emerge from the shimmering heat of the morning, a hulking silhouette against the rising sun. He was large, his hat pulled low, obscuring his face. His rifle, long and dark, rested across his saddle. Behind him, two more figures materialized, then another. 4, she counted, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust that hung heavy in the still air. They were still far enough away that their faces were indistinct, but their posture, the way they moved, spoke of a casual menace, a practiced swagger that came from years of intimidating the vulnerable. Her gaze hardened. This was not a negotiation. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of aggression, a violation of the fragile peace she had built for herself. The moral conflict deepened, pushing her toward a stark choice: succumb or resist. But resistance, she knew, would not be a polite refusal. It would be a brutal, bloody fight for survival. A cold resolve settled over her, a quiet understanding of what was to come. She felt a familiar ache deep in her muscles, a dormant memory stirring, a readiness for something she had long since buried. The sun, now fully above the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows of the approaching men, stretching them like skeletal fingers towards her quiet home. A faint scent, carried on the strengthening breeze, reached Alara. The sharp, acrid tang of unwashed bodies, mixed with stale tobacco smoke and horse sweat. It was the smell of men who lived hard, uncaring lives, men who had long ago shed the thin veneer of civility. This wasn't merely a band of outlaws. This was a predatory pack, drawn by the same insatiable hunger her husband had often warned about. He used to tell tales of the gold fever that gripped men during the California gold rush of '49, transforming even the most pious into ruthless opportunists, abandoning families and honor for the promise of quick riches. This hunger, he believed, had never truly left the frontier. It simply mutated, taking new forms. She watched them through the narrow crack, observing their movements, their unspoken communication. The leader, a hulking man with a broad-brimmed hat, dismounted first, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He surveyed the cabin with a slow, appraising glance, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to the desert's silent counsel. His companions fanned out, their rifles held loosely, but with an air of readiness. They moved with the practiced ease of men accustomed to such endeavors, a chilling synchronization that spoke of past successes and little fear of repercussions. Alara's gaze sharpened, taking in details: the rust on one man's spurs, the missing finger on another's left hand, the way a third spat tobacco juice without breaking stride. These were not greenhorns. These were hardened individuals, likely veterans of skirmishes, perhaps even former soldiers turned rogue. Their horses, though ridden hard, were well fed, their coats glistening faintly in the rising sun. This implied a degree of planning, perhaps even a base of operations not too far off. They weren't just wandering vagrants, they were organized. The leader, whose face was still obscured by shadow and distance, made a subtle gesture with his hand. One of the men, a wiry individual with a lean build, began to circle wide, heading towards the back of the cabin. His intent was clear: to cut off any escape route, to ensure the prey was fully cornered. A chill, not of fear but of primal instinct, tightened Alara's stomach. She knew the layout of her small property intimately, every stone, every dip in the ground. This man was walking into a known territory, a territory that would soon become a hunting ground. Her mind raced, sifting through options. A direct confrontation, even with her husband's rifle, would be suicidal against 5 armed men in the open. Retreating into the desert was possible, but it meant abandoning everything, and she was loath to surrender the last vestiges of her husband's memory. The memory of his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the sanctity of their home, burned bright within her. He had often spoken of the moral imperative to defend one's hearth and home, a conviction deeply rooted in the frontier ethos, where justice was often self-administered. To him, the land was not merely property. It was an extension of one's soul. A faded calico dress, hanging on a peg near the hearth, caught her eye. It was her husband's favorite, the one she wore on Sundays when he would read to her from the Bible. A pang of raw grief, sharp and unexpected, pierced through her practiced composure. She had promised him, on his deathbed, that she would protect this place, that she would carry on the quiet life they had built together. The thought of these men trampling over his legacy, desecrating his final resting place, ignited a cold, unwavering fury. She recalled a story her husband used to tell, a frontier legend of a ghost rider who haunted the plains, striking down those who desecrated sacred ground. It was a tale meant to deter greedy prospectors and land grabbers, a cultural belief woven into the fabric of the West. While she didn't believe in literal ghosts, the sentiment resonated deeply. These men were violating something sacred, and they would pay a price. The man circling the cabin had reached the thorny stand of mesquite, his movements still wary, but growing bolder with each step. He glanced back at the leader, a silent affirmation of his position. The leader nodded, a predatory gleam visible even from this distance. They were closing the net. Alara moved with a sudden, decisive grace, a silent ripple of movement in the dim cabin. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, went not for the rifle, but for a smaller, sharper object, tucked away in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. It was a hunting knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge, its handle wrapped in worn leather. Not her husband's knife, but one she had kept hidden, a relic from a different life, a life she had tried to bury beneath layers of domesticity and sorrow. The feel of the cold steel in her palm was both alien and intensely familiar, like greeting a long-lost part of herself. The conflict now was not about escape or defense, but about engagement. It was about how to turn their perceived advantage into their fatal mistake. The leader outside, with his confident swagger, thought he had cornered a lamb. He was about to learn that he had stumbled into a wolf's den, and the wolf was long overdue for a hunt. The silence that had initially been a premonition now became a weapon, a cloak for her intentions, a shroud for the approaching darkness. A low whisper of wind, like a serpent coiling through dry grass, was the only sound now, masking the subtle shift of Alara's weight as she crouched lower, pressing her eye to the knothole. The leader, a burly figure now, was giving silent commands, his hand gestures sharp and economical. He was clearly a man of experience, used to orchestrating such assaults. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to bore into the cabin, a hungry, calculating stare. He was looking for any sign of life, any flicker of movement, anything to confirm their easy victory. He was looking for fear, and he found only silence. One of the men, a lean individual with a prominent nose, moved directly to the front door, testing its sturdy frame with a tentative push. It held firm. A grunt of annoyance escaped his lips, a small, involuntary sound that carried surprisingly clearly across the still air. He exchanged a glance with the leader, who gave a slight nod. The man then raised the butt of his rifle, preparing to smash it against the weathered wood. This was their standard approach: intimidation, then brute force. They were not subtle men, and they expected no subtlety in return. Alara's gaze drifted to the small collection of personal effects on a shelf near the window, a faded tintype of her and her husband, a small ceramic bird her mother had gifted her, a worn Bible. These were not just objects, they were anchors, tethering her to a life that these men were about to shatter. The concept of manifest destiny, a popular belief during this era, often justified the forceful expansion into lands already occupied. Viewing the removal of inhabitants as a natural and even righteous progression, these men, in their own crude way, embodied a similar sentiment, a right to take what they desired, regardless of ownership or consequence. But Alara was not merely a passive inhabitant. She was a force of the land itself. She recalled a story her Apache mentors used to tell, a cautionary tale about the coyote who, in his arrogance, thought he could outwit the badger by simply digging a bigger hole. The badger, patient and cunning, simply waited, and when the coyote was exhausted, the badger struck from an unexpected angle. It was a lesson in humility, in the dangers of underestimating your opponent, especially one rooted in the land. Alara felt a peculiar kinship with the badger now. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, but her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. The knife felt cool and reassuring in her grip. It was a tool, an extension of her will. She didn't want to use it, not truly. There was a part of her, the part that remembered sunlight and laughter, that recoiled from the inevitable bloodshed. This was her moral conflict, to unleash the primal ferocity she had suppressed for years, or to allow these men to desecrate all that she held dear. The choice, in its grim clarity, was no choice at all. Survival demanded a return to a path she had sworn to abandon. The thud of the rifle butt against the door echoed dully, a jarring intrusion into the morning's quiet. The wood groaned but did not splinter. The man grunted again, frustration coloring his features. He raised the rifle for a second, more powerful strike. This was her moment. They were focused on the front, their backs to the less obvious approaches. They believed themselves safe, enclosed in their circle of aggression. Alara melted away from the knothole, her movements fluid and silent as a desert cat. She moved towards the rear wall, where a loose panel, cleverly disguised, offered a clandestine exit. Her husband had built it as a precaution, a hidden escape route in case of Apache raids. A grim irony, given her true past. He had never imagined the threat would come from men who looked like him, men who spoke his language. The panel slid open with barely a whisper, revealing the cool, damp earth beneath the cabin. She slipped through the opening, careful not to disturb a single pebble. Old Jack, still beneath the cabin, whined softly, but she silenced him with a gentle touch to his muzzle. He understood. He was loyal, and he was smart enough to trust her instincts. Outside, the air was sharp and cool against her skin. She was on the blind side of the cabin, concealed by a tangle of thorny bushes and a low ridge of rock. The man who had circled wide was now positioned behind a small outcrop of boulders, his rifle pointing towards the cabin's rear. He was confident, his posture relaxed, too relaxed. He clearly hadn't noticed the hidden exit, nor the subtle shift in the air that spoke of an impending, violent reckoning. Alara moved, not running, but flowing over the uneven ground, her feet barely making a sound. Her gaze was fixed on the man behind the boulders, her mind already calculating the distance, the angle, the precise moment. The sun was now a fiery disk, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the mesa like grasping fingers. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rapid beat of her own heart. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the silent widow was about to reclaim the part of herself that had been forged in the unforgiving crucible of the Apache wilderness. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Alara's hand as she gripped the hilt of the knife. It wasn't fear, but a ghost of an old memory, a ripple from a past she had meticulously buried beneath layers of quiet domesticity. Her husband, Thomas, with his gentle eyes and calloused hands, had often said she was a creature of peace, a woman forged for sun-dappled mornings and quiet evenings. He had never seen the other side of her, the one honed by hardship and the unforgiving wisdom of the desert. He believed she was simply Alara, the quiet widow, and she had tried to be that woman for him and for herself. But the approaching ruffians were tearing through that carefully constructed peace, ripping away the fragile veil she had draped over her true self. A flash of raw, unfiltered memory erupted in her mind. The searing heat of a summer sun, the smell of dust and sweat, and the guttural roar of a warrior. She was no longer just Alara. She was a girl again, kneeling in the dirt, her small hands wrapped around a rough wooden practice blade. Her father, as she called him then, was not a white man, but a grizzled Apache elder named Nanton. He was a man of stark silences and brutal truths, his face weathered like ancient rock formations, his eyes sharp and knowing. He had found her, a lost child, orphaned by a forgotten skirmish, and raised her among his people, the Chiricahua Apache, in the harsh, beautiful lands of the Arizona Territory. This was a time when the U.S. government's policy of Indian removal was relentlessly pushing tribes onto reservations, leading to frequent, violent clashes and the displacement of countless indigenous peoples. Alara had witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of this expansion, shaping her understanding of survival. Nanton had taught her to hunt, to track, to read the subtle language of the wind and the sun. But more than anything, he had taught her to fight, not with guns, though she learned to shoot as well, but with the blade. The knife, he had explained, was an extension of the warrior's spirit, a direct connection to the enemy, demanding courage and precision. He would make her practice for hours under the scorching sun, her muscles aching, her spirit screaming in frustration. He spoke of the ghost blade, a concept among some Apache bands, where the knife was seen as not merely metal, but a living spirit, guiding the hand of the true warrior. "The knife does not lie," Nanton's raspy voice echoed in her mind, clear as if he stood beside her now. "It tells you who you are, child. Fast or slow, brave or weak. It asks for everything." She remembered a particular lesson, one that had nearly broken her. Nanton had blindfolded her, spun her around, and then released a small, quick-footed rabbit into a confined space. Her task was to catch it with her wooden blade, not to harm, but to demonstrate control and instinct. The first few attempts were clumsy, frustrating failures. The rabbit, sensing her hesitation, darted away with ease. Nanton watched, unblinking, his face impassive. "Fear makes you slow," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "Doubt makes you blind. Trust your senses. Trust the blade. Become the blade." The moral conflict then, as now, was profound. It wasn't about whether she could fight. It was about whether she would. Could she allow herself to revert to the primal, ruthless warrior she had once been? Could she shed the skin of the peaceful widow and embrace the violence that Nantan had so carefully forged within her. Thomas, with his quiet dignity, would have been horrified. He believed in law, in due process, in a justice that was meted out by civilization, not by the swift, silent swing of a blade. But civilization was miles away, and these men carried their own brutal brand of law. A dry branch snapped somewhere ahead of her, a harsh punctuation in the quiet. It was the circling ruffian, moving slowly, cautiously. He thought he was being stealthy, but Alara could hear the subtle shift of pebbles under his boots, the faint rasp of his denim against his rifle stock. He was a loud man, even in his attempts at silence. He was predictable. Her gaze hardened, the memory of Nantan's stern face superimposed over the sparse mesquite. He had taught her not to hesitate, not to question, when survival was at stake. He had taught her to listen to the whisper of the wind, to the rustle of the leaves, to the silent song of the earth. These were the only truths that mattered in a fight for life. The gentle hand that tended her garden was now the hand that gripped the cold steel, the transformation complete. The silent widow was no more. Only the warrior remained, waiting, listening, her senses acutely alive to every sound, every scent, every shift in the dry desert air. She was the desert now, unforgiving and lethal. The sun climbed higher, bathing the stark landscape in a blinding, unforgiving light. Yet within Alara, a different kind of darkness was awakening. It was the deep, resonant darkness of the desert night, where senses sharpened and inhibitions dissolved. She remembered Nantan's weathered face, his eyes like polished obsidian, as he spoke of the tseko, the way of the knife. It wasn't merely a fighting technique. It was a philosophy, a spiritual connection to the blade, a belief held by some Apache bands that the knife itself possessed a spirit that would guide the wielder in battle. This wasn't about brute force, but about precision, about reading your opponent's intent and striking with the swift, silent decisiveness of a coiled rattlesnake. One particular memory burned bright, etched into her very bones. She was perhaps 12, wiry and quick, but still prone to youthful impetuosity. Nantan had set up a drill, a series of clay pots, each representing an enemy, positioned at varying distances and angles. Her task was to kill them with a blunted practice knife, moving through the sparse brush, striking with fluidity and speed. She had approached it like a game, rushing, making too much noise. Nantan had stopped her, his voice a low rumble that nevertheless commanded absolute attention. "You fight like the coyote, child," he had said, his gaze piercing. "All teeth and haste, the true warrior is the owl, silent, patient, and when it strikes, it is already gone before the prey knows it is dead." He demonstrated, his movements deceptively slow, yet impossibly fast. He glided through the terrain, his body a fluid shadow, and then in a blink, his hand would move, the blunted blade finding its mark with a soft thud. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, just pure, lethal efficiency. He taught her to hold the knife, not just with her hand, but with her entire body, to let the blade become an extension of her own will. He emphasized the grip, not too tight, which would lead to rigidity and fatigue, but firm enough to prevent slippage, allowing for subtle adjustments. The blade, he explained, was a continuation of the forearm, the elbow, the shoulder, the entire body working in unison. He drilled her in specific targets, the soft underbelly, the vulnerable throat, the tendons in the leg, the quick, precise strike to disable rather than simply injure. "A wounded animal is dangerous," he'd taught. "A dead one is not, but a crippled one can be used to send a message." This moral conflict was stark, the cold logic of survival overriding any innate human aversion to cruelty. The Apache, facing constant threats to their survival, often employed psychological warfare as a deterrent. The moral weight of this training, The embrace of such cold, calculated violence had been a burden she carried for years. When she met Thomas, she had sought to shed it, to find peace in a life free from conflict. He had been her anchor, pulling her away from the precipice of that brutal past. Now, that anchor was gone, and the tide of violence was pulling her back. The conflict between the gentle widow she had become and the silent warrior she truly was raged within her. But necessity was a brutal mistress, and survival demanded the warrior. She remembered Nantan's lesson on camouflage, not just of the body, but of the spirit. "Become part of the land, child," he would say, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Let the wind carry your scent away. Let the shadows hide your form. Let your heart beat with the rhythm of the earth." He had taught her to find cover in the most unlikely places, to use the sparse vegetation, the subtle undulations of the ground, to become invisible. He spoke of the desert as a living entity, a stern but fair teacher, offering lessons in both endurance and evasion. This belief, common among many indigenous peoples of the American Southwest, fostered a deep respect and practical understanding of their environment. Now, as she crept through the sparse mesquite, her body low to the ground, she moved with the practiced ease of that long-forgotten girl. The circling ruffian was still oblivious, his focus fixed on the cabin, convinced he had secured the perimeter. He was a large man, his movements heavy, a stark contrast to Alara's lithe grace. His rifle was slung loosely across his chest, his attention divided between his assigned position and the impatient, waiting for the main assault to begin. A small, prickly pear cactus lay directly in her path, its spines glinting wickedly in the sun. She bypassed it effortlessly, her bare arm brushing against a sharp thorn, but she felt no pain. Her senses were heightened, tuned to the rhythm of the desert, to the subtle shift in the ruffian's weight, to the faint sounds of the other men at the front of the cabin. She was an owl, silent and patient, and her prey was directly ahead, unaware of the shadow that was about to fall. The ghost blade hummed in her hand, a silent promise of the violence it was about to unleash. A low, guttural grunt from the cabin's front indicated the ruffians were growing impatient, their attempts to breach the door proving more difficult than anticipated. This provided Alara with the precious seconds she needed, a small window of opportunity carved out of their frustrated efforts. She moved not just with purpose, but with a terrifying stillness. A predator stalking its unaware quarry. Her husband, Thomas, often spoke of the sheer grit of the early pioneers, how they had to be self-sufficient, building their homes from the ground up, fortifying them against the elements and sometimes against other men. He had built this cabin with his own hands, each timber carefully notched, each stone precisely laid. It was a testament to his quiet strength. And now, to her defense, she reached the unsuspecting ruffian, who remained fixed on the cabin, his back still partially turned. He was a brute, large and thick-necked, his silhouette cast long and distorted by the morning sun. His rifle was still slung, his attention seemingly undivided, yet unfocused. He expected no threat from this direction, only open, vulnerable land. This overconfidence, a common trait among men who regularly preyed on the weak, was his undoing. Alara moved into his blind spot, her steps utterly silent on the dry earth. The knife, an extension of her hand, felt alive, humming with a latent energy. She thought of Nantan's lessons on the breath of the kill, a moment when the predator and prey existed in a shared, suspended silence, just before the strike. It was a moment of absolute clarity, free from thought, pure instinct. The ruffian shifted his weight, a subtle tremor in the ground warning her of his movement. He cleared his throat, a raspy sound, and then slowly raised his rifle to adjust its sling. This was the moment. She didn't hesitate. Her hand darted out, not aiming for a fatal blow, but for a strategic one. The blade found the side of his leg, a swift, deep cut to the vastus lateralis, the large muscle on the outer thigh. A sharp, shocked gasp tore from the man's throat, quickly stifled as pain flared. He stumbled, his rifle clattering to the ground. He spun, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and agony, searching for his attacker. But Alara was already moving, a blur of motion. Before he could fully turn, before he could even register her presence, she was behind him. Another swift surgical strike, this time to the back of his knee, severing the hamstrings. He crumpled to the ground with a choked cry, his leg buckling uselessly beneath him. He was a large man, but the surprise and the sudden incapacitating pain rendered him helpless. He thrashed, reaching for his rifle, but Alara was quicker. She kicked the weapon away, sending it skittering across the dust. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, then a dawning horror. He had expected a frightened widow. He found something else entirely. "No one hears you out here," Alara whispered, her voice a low, chilling rasp, devoid of emotion. It was a truth of the frontier, a cold, hard fact that isolated homesteads were beyond the reach of human cry. The concept of silent justice was not uncommon in these remote areas, where grievances were settled by individuals, far from the formal structures of law. This brutal practicality was deeply ingrained in the frontier psyche. She bound his hands quickly with a length of sturdy rawhide she carried, a remnant from her husband's trapping days. Then she used another piece to gag him, ensuring his cries would remain unheard. He stared up at her, fear now replacing the shock in his eyes, a desperate, silent plea. But Alara's face was a mask, hardened by memory and the grim necessities of survival. This wasn't personal, it was war. And in this war, every advantage had to be seized. She dragged his heavy form, not gently, towards a small, shallow arroyo hidden by a cluster of gnarled junipers. The sun, now a brazen eye in the sky, beat down relentlessly, making the task arduous. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the distant landscape, blurring the line between reality and mirage. This desert, often perceived as empty, was full of hidden dangers and opportunities for those who knew how to read its subtle signs. As she concealed the man, she thought of the Apache belief in spirit debt. If one shed blood, especially unfairly, a spiritual debt was incurred, one that could only be paid through suffering or sacrifice. Alara didn't believe in such superstitions, but the act of incapacitating the man, rather than killing him outright, was a silent testament to the fragile peace she had tried to maintain. It was a lingering echo of Thomas's gentle influence, a moral line she was unwilling to cross, for now. But the line was thin, stretching taut, and the ruffians' continued assault was pushing her closer to breaking it. She checked the man's pockets, extracting a crude map, dog-eared and stained, with a rough X marked near her cabin's location. Beside the X, a small, hastily scrawled note, "Widow, alone, rumors of gold." The greed was palpable, a tangible thing that had driven these men across unforgiving miles. Her husband had always dismissed the rumors of gold on their land as foolish whispers, but it seemed the whispers had found an eager audience. She crumpled the map, her resolve solidifying. They would not get their gold or anything else. A guttural shout from the front of the cabin tore through the relative quiet, confirming Alara's suspicions. The ruffians had finally broken through the sturdy wooden door. The sharp crack of splintering wood was a grim punctuation mark, signifying the end of her precarious peace and the violent beginning of their intrusion. They thought they had won, believing the cabin to be empty save for a terrified woman. Their triumph, however, was about to curdle into a bitter, deadly surprise. The sheer audacity of their violation fueled Alara's resolve, sharpening the edges of her already honed instincts. She remained low, moving silently through the sparse cover of the arroyo, the desert sun already beating down with an intensity that promised a brutal day. The man she had incapacitated lay still, gagged and bound, his eyes wide with a silent, desperate terror. He was a pawn, a stark example of the fate that awaited his comrades if they underestimated the silent widow. Her moral compass, once wavering between the peaceful life she had chosen and the brutal one she had abandoned, now pointed decisively towards survival, a stark, unyielding truth. A second later, loud crashes and shouts erupted from within the cabin, confirming their entry. They were tearing through her home, ransacking her few possessions, looking for the phantom gold that had driven them here. The sound was a desecration, a violation of the sacred space she had shared with Thomas. He had believed in the sanctity of one's home, a deep-seated Western cultural value where a man's dwelling was his castle, fiercely protected from intrusion. To hear it invaded in such a crude, violent manner ignited a cold fury within her, a primal urge to protect what was hers. She began to circle, not towards the cabin, but wider, using the undulating terrain to remain unseen. Her Apache training had taught her to anticipate an opponent's next move, to think not just of the immediate threat, but of the sequence of actions that would follow. They would clear the cabin, find nothing of value immediately, and then fan out, searching the immediate vicinity. She needed to intercept them, to break their formation, to turn their numbers against them. Alara remembered Nantan's lesson on the dance of distractions. He had taught her how to use the environment, how to create diversions that would draw an enemy's attention, forcing them to reveal themselves or break their focus. He had spoken of the prairie fire, a potent symbol of unchecked power and chaos, but also a tool that could be wielded by those who understood its nature. She had no fire, but she had something equally potent, the element of the unexpected. She moved towards a low-lying thicket of creosote bushes, their pungent medicinal scent filling the air. Beyond them lay a narrow, winding gulch, its floor a patchwork of loose gravel and sharp stones. It was a natural trap, a place where a careless footfall could lead to a twisted ankle or a loud, revealing tumble. This gulch was her arena, a place where her intimate knowledge of the land would give her an undeniable advantage over men accustomed to open plains or the relative predictability of town streets. As she reached the edge of the gulch, she heard the muffled shouts growing closer. Two of the ruffians, judging by the sound of their voices, were emerging from the cabin, undoubtedly frustrated by their initial lack of success. "Ain't nothing here, boss!" one of them yelled, his voice rough and impatient. "Just old woman's junk." The leader's response was a low growl. "She's got something. I can feel it. Spread out. Check the outbuildings, the well, everything." Alara pressed herself against the dusty bank of the gulch, her senses hyper-alert. She could hear them now, closer, their heavy boots crunching on the dry earth, their breathing ragged with exertion and growing irritation. The sun, now high overhead, cast almost no shadows, forcing her to rely more on subtle movements and absolute stillness rather than concealment by darkness. This was a moral conflict within her, to passively hide and hope they left, or to actively engage and bring the fight to them. The decision was made the moment they breached her door. One of the men, a large, hulking figure with a greasy beard, stomped towards the gulch, his rifle held loosely. He scanned the immediate area, his eyes narrowed against the harsh sun, clearly annoyed. "Damn heat," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He glanced down into the gulch, his eyes sweeping past Alara's concealed position without registering her presence. He saw only rocks and dry brush, the empty vastness of the desert. He was about to step down into the gulch, his attention still focused on the sparse outbuildings beyond. His boot hovered over a loose rock at the edge. Alara waited, her muscles coiled, her breath held. This was it, the first test of her resolve, the first true engagement. The silent widow was about to show them that some treasures, like some women, were not easily taken. A rattlesnake's dry rattle, sharp and sudden, sliced through the midday stillness, not from an actual snake, but from Alara's lips, a sound honed by years of living on the edge of the wild. It was a precise ancient warning, startling the ruffian, just as his boot was about to descend into the gulch. He flinched, pulling his foot back, his eyes darting frantically around. He was looking for the source of the sound, for the coiled death he instinctively feared. This split-second hesitation, this primal distraction, was all Alara needed. She launched herself from her hiding spot, a blur of motion against the parched earth. Her target was the man's extended arm, the one holding the rifle. Her Apache training had taught her to disarm swiftly, not just to neutralize the weapon, but to create a momentary shock, a psychological blow that crippled the enemy's resolve. The cultural understanding of the frontier settler was often rooted in direct face-to-face combat, but Alara moved like the desert itself, a silent, unseen force. The knife moved in a flashing arc, not a stab, but a precise downward slice, severing the tendons in his forearm, just below the elbow. A scream, raw and agonizing, tore from the ruffian's throat as his fingers went numb. Releasing the rifle with a clatter onto the rocks, he stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face contorted in disbelief and searing pain. He looked at Alara, his eyes wide, recognizing too late that this was no ordinary widow. "This land takes what it's owed!" Alara hissed, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, a chilling counterpoint to the ruffian's cries. She delivered a swift kick to his good leg, sending him sprawling into the gulch, landing with a sickening thud amongst the loose stones. He lay there, writhing, unable to move, his pain a loud, discordant note in the otherwise silent drama. The sound of his scream, though muffled by distance and the echoing gulch, would carry. It would draw the others. Alara knew this. Her plan was not to eliminate them all silently, but to disorient, to divide, and to expose their weaknesses. The moral conflict of resorting to such violence was now a cold ember, buried beneath the white-hot necessity of survival. She was not a judge. She was a survivor. She quickly snatched up the dropped rifle, inspecting it. A lever-action Winchester, a reliable, iconic firearm of the American West, designed for rapid firing. It was a powerful tool, but cumbersome in close quarters and loud. She decided against using it immediately, opting instead to tuck it away in a small crevice she knew, a hidden cache for later use. Her preference remained the blade, a weapon of intimacy and silence. From the cabin, she heard frantic shouts. "Jed, what in tarnation was that?" It was the leader's voice, laced with impatience and a dawning suspicion. The ruffians were now alerted, their initial arrogance replaced by a ripple of unease. They were no longer hunting, they were being hunted. This reversal of roles was Alara's ultimate advantage. She moved swiftly, not towards the cabin, but around the perimeter of the gulch, using its natural contours to remain unseen. Her knowledge of the land was her greatest weapon. She knew every hidden path, every deceptive shadow, every thorny bush that could provide cover. This was her domain, and they were trespassers, blundering through a landscape that whispered secrets to her alone. Many indigenous cultures of the American West held a deep, almost spiritual connection to their land, viewing it not as property, but as a living entity that offered both sustenance and protection. Alara embodied this connection, using the terrain as an extension of her own will. She heard heavy footsteps approaching the gulch, followed by the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. "Jed!" a voice called out, closer now, laced with a mix of concern and irritation. "Answer me, damn it!" One of the ruffians, a stocky man with a wide, cruel face, appeared at the edge of the gulch, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. He saw the rifle lying on the rocks, then Jed, crumpled and bleeding at the bottom. His face contorted in shock, then rage. "What the—" he began, his gaze sweeping frantically around, trying to comprehend what had happened. He looked from Jed to the empty expanse, completely baffled. The idea that a lone, silent woman could inflict such damage was beyond his comprehension. Alara was already moving, her movements almost imperceptible. She circled behind him, using a large boulder as cover. He was distracted, his attention fixed on his injured comrade, his rifle pointed uselessly at the sky. He was focused on the perceived threat, not the real one. Her heart beat a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs, a counterpoint to the frantic pounding of his. The dance of shadows had begun, and Alara was leading. The air crackled with the man's bewildered fury, his eyes still scanning the empty gulch, unable to reconcile the sight of his wounded comrade with the unseen hand that had struck him down. He bellowed a curse, a ragged sound that echoed off the dry earth, and then, slowly, cautiously, he started to descend into the gulch, his rifle now held at the ready, his eyes darting frantically. He was no longer arrogant, he was wary, a crucial shift in his demeanor that Alara instantly registered. This was a man beginning to feel fear, a dangerous opponent, but also a predictable one. Alara melted further into the shadows cast by the large boulder, becoming a part of the landscape Nantan had taught her to mimic. She recalled a fundamental lesson from her Apache training. The earth is your shield, the wind is your voice, and the sun is your blinding ally. He had shown her how to use the sun's glare, the shimmering heat of the desert, to her advantage, how to position herself so that the enemy faced the direct blinding light, while she remained concealed in the relative shadow. This subtle tactical maneuver, often employed by Apache warriors against encroaching U.S. cavalry during the Apache Wars of the late 19th century, was a testament to their profound understanding of their environment. The ruffian reached Jed, who was still writhing in pain, clutching his bleeding arm. "Who did this, Jed? Where are they?" The man snarled, his voice tight with a mixture of concern and growing dread. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the empty canyon walls. His rifle, a powerful .45-70 Springfield, was a heavy, formidable weapon, but its length made it cumbersome in the confined space of the gulch. He was exposed, his attention divided between his injured companion and the unseen threat. This was Alara's opening. She moved with a sudden, fluid burst of motion, a shadow detaching itself from the rock face. Her movement was a blur, too fast for the man to register before she was upon him. The blade, honed to a wicked sharpness, found its mark with chilling precision. Not a killing blow, not yet. This was about incapacitation, about turning his strength into a weakness. She drove the knife into his calf, a swift, deep thrust that severed the Achilles tendon. A roar of pain erupted from the man's throat, a strangled sound of agony and disbelief. He stumbled, his leg collapsing beneath him, sending him crashing onto the rocky floor of the gulch. His rifle flew from his grasp, sliding across the loose stones. He tried to scramble away, his face contorted in pain, his eyes wide with stark terror as he finally saw Alara. She stood over him, the knife held low, its blade glinting wickedly in the harsh sun. Her face was impassive, her eyes reflecting the cold, hard light of the desert. "You came for gold," she whispered, her voice barely audible over his gasping breaths. "This land takes what it's owed." The moral conflict that had once gnawed at her, The struggle between compassion and ruthless survival had been utterly subsumed by the primal need to defend her home. Thomas's gentle spirit, once a tempering influence, was now merely a distant echo. She quickly bound his hands and gagged him, using strips of rawhide she had carried. The process was swift and efficient, a practiced ritual of subjugation. He lay next to Jed, both men now helpless, their grunts and whines the only sounds filling the gulch. The quiet of the desert had been broken, but only by the sounds of their suffering, a testament to her quiet, brutal efficiency. From above, Alara heard the sound of approaching footsteps, heavier now, and more cautious. The leader, no doubt, and the remaining ruffians. They would be moving as a unit, their initial confidence shattered by the cries of their fallen comrades. This was the true test, the moment where she would face the full force of their numbers and their desperation. She did not wait for them. Instead, she moved quickly, retrieving the rifle she had hidden earlier. This time, she would use it, not as a weapon of close-quarters combat, but as a deterrent, a warning shot. She knew the power of a single, well-placed shot. In the vast silence of the desert, it spoke of a hidden presence, of an unseen threat, of something far more formidable than a lone widow. She positioned herself on a small rise overlooking the gulch, concealed by a cluster of boulders and a few tenacious desert pines. She chambered around, the metallic click a stark sound in the stillness. She aimed not at the approaching men, but at a cluster of rocks far beyond them, a place where the ricochet would be loud and dramatic, but harmless. She needed to sow fear, to make them hesitate, to give her time. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering veil. The two incapacitated ruffians writhed in the gulch, their pain a silent scream against the vast indifference of the landscape. Alara watched, her heart a steady drum, her mind clear and focused. The silent widow was gone, replaced by the Apache knife fighter, ready to defend her home, to reclaim her peace. One blade, one bullet, one silent strike at a time. The sharp crack of the rifle shot reverberated across the mesa, a thunderclap in the oppressive silence, tearing through the thin veil of the ruffians' remaining bravado. It was a sound that bespoke hidden danger, not the casual pop of a lone hunter, but a deliberate, calculated report that echoed with menace. The bullet, aimed at a distant rock, sent a spray of shale chips exploding into the air, a visual punctuation mark to the chilling auditory assault. The leader, a man named Silas, instantly dropped to a crouch, his eyes darting frantically. His companions, two hulking figures named Thorn and Pike, mirrored his reaction, their faces suddenly pale beneath their grime. "Where in the blazes did that come from?" Thorn rasped, his voice tight, with a fear he usually reserved for lawmen. They had expected a quiet confrontation, a swift taking of what they desired. This was not the frightened resistance of a lone woman. This was a well-executed ambush, a tactic they usually reserved for their own victims. The unexpected nature of the shot, its disembodied origin, shattered their collective composure. Silas, however, was the man hardened by years of brutal living. He had seen fear in the eyes of many, and he knew how to exploit it. He was a product of the post-Civil War era, where many disillusioned veterans, North and South, found themselves adrift, turning to outlawry in a land struggling to redefine itself. He had seen men break under less, and he had learned to adapt. His eyes, though wary, narrowed with a dangerous calculation. "She's got a rifle," he growled, his voice low, but carrying a chilling certainty. "And she ain't alone." This was his tactical genius, or perhaps his fatal flaw. He couldn't conceive of a lone woman posing such a threat. His mind, steeped in the cultural myth of women as inherently weaker, as passive targets, struggled to process the reality before him. He believed there must be unseen allies, perhaps vengeful Apache warriors or a reclusive prospector supporting her. This miscalculation, rooted in deeply ingrained gender biases of the time, would prove to be his undoing. Alara watched them from her concealed position, her finger still resting on the trigger, the residual kick of the rifle, a familiar comfort against her shoulder. She saw the fear, the confusion, and then, in Silas's eyes, the hardening resolve. He was a dangerous man, a wolf among lesser predators, and he would not be easily deterred. Her moral conflict was no longer about whether to fight, but how far she was willing to go. These men, in their rapacious greed, represented a sickness she had seen before, a blight on the land she cherished. Silas pointed towards the arroyo where Jed and the second man lay incapacitated. "Thorn, Pike, check the gulch. See what happened to Jed and Miller," he ordered, his voice sharper now, regaining some of its authority. His confidence was rebuilding, fueled by the familiar rhythm of issuing commands, of asserting control. Thorn and Pike, despite their earlier apprehension, moved reluctantly towards the gulch, their rifles held tighter, their movements more tentative. They were no longer swaggering, they were cautious. Alara let them go. Her aim was not to engage them all at once, but to systematically reduce their numbers, to make them bleed, to break their will. This was a long game, a slow, methodical unraveling of their aggression. She heard their shocked gasps as they discovered their injured comrades. "Holy hell, Jed's cut up bad!" Thorn yelled, his voice laced with genuine alarm. "And Miller's got his leg twisted all to blazes." "Who did this?" Pike demanded, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and rage. They were looking for a man, a hidden gunman, a fierce warrior. They were looking for an enemy they understood, an enemy they knew how to fight. They were completely unprepared for a silent, vengeful widow. Silas, hearing their reports, let out a frustrated roar. "She's got traps! She's laying for us! Don't you see it?" His voice was filled with a bitter realization. The lamb was a wolf, and the wolf was playing a deadly game. The moral dilemma for Silas now was whether to retreat, to acknowledge defeat, or to press on, risking his remaining men for a prize that seemed to slip further from his grasp with every passing minute. His pride, however, would not allow retreat. The rumors of gold, exaggerated as they might have been, had become a point of honor, a challenge to his reputation as a ruthless enforcer. Alara shifted her position, moving silently through the sparse brush, her bare feet finding purchase on the uneven ground. She had created chaos, sown doubt, and now she would amplify it. She aimed the rifle again, not at the men, but at the well, a vital source of water for the cabin. It was a crude but effective warning. She would not let them desecrate her home, nor defile the source of life on this parched land. The next shot, she knew, would be more than just a warning. It would be a promise of what was to come. A shiver, not of cold, but of grim anticipation, traced its way down Alara's spine as she brought the Winchester to her shoulder. The thud of Jed and Miller hitting the gulch floor, their cries echoing, had transformed the landscape from an empty expanse into a theater of pain. Silas's frustrated roar, a raw testament to his shattered control, was music to her ears. He was losing his grip, and in the harsh calculus of survival, that meant he was becoming predictable. She thought of Thomas, his laughter echoing in her mind like the distant chime of a bell. He had been a man of unwavering faith, a believer in the inherent goodness of humanity. He had often spoken of the providence of God, a common spiritual belief among Western settlers, suggesting that divine intervention guided one's path and provided protection. He would have advocated for prayer, for turning the other cheek, but the men outside, with their crude brutality, offered no such path. Her moral conflict intensified, a battle between the gentle lessons of her husband and the brutal truths of her past. Could she truly reconcile the two? or was one destined to consume the other? The well, a stone-lined circle near the cabin, shimmered under the direct sun, its cool depth a beacon of life in the parched land. It was a vital artery, and Silas, if he thought clearly, would eventually try to secure it. Her shot was not to destroy it, but to mark it, to send a clear message. This was her territory, and every resource within it was under her command. She aimed for the well's wooden crank, a strong, thick beam that would splinter dramatically under the impact of a high-powered round. The sharp crack of the second shot ripped through the air, even louder than the first, in the now tense silence. The wooden crank exploded, shards of splintered wood flying, one piece whipping past Thorne's ear with a furious buzz. "Damn it!" Thorne yelled, ducking instinctively. "She's shooting at the well!" Silas, however, did not flinch. His eyes, though still wary, now held a new, chilling gleam. He had recovered his composure, his mind calculating. "She ain't shooting to kill," he barked, his voice laced with grudging respect and a renewed, dangerous resolve. "She's playing with us, trying to scare us off. She's got something out here, and she's protecting it." His greed, momentarily eclipsed by fear, now resurfaced with an even greater intensity. The idea that a lone woman could be so bold, so calculated, without some hidden prize, was inconceivable to him. The frontier lore, filled with tales of hidden gold caches and lost mines, fed his conviction. He looked at Thorne and Pike, his gaze hard. "She knows this land. She's got us scattered. We go in together. Form up. We rush the cabin." He pointed towards the small, sturdy structure, his voice regaining its accustomed authority. "She's got a rifle, but she ain't got no army. We hit her hard, we hit her fast. Get that gold, then we disappear." The moral conflict within Alara tightened. They were coming for her. This was no longer about skirmishes and warnings. It was about the final brutal confrontation. Could she bring herself to take a life, to shed blood in defense of her home, or would she falter? Her Apache mentors, particularly Nantan, had instilled in her a profound understanding of the sanctity of life, even the life of an enemy. But they had also taught her the absolute necessity of survival, the cold, hard truth that sometimes, to live, one must kill. This was the ultimate test of Nantan's teachings, the brutal intersection of spiritual belief and practical necessity. She saw them gather, Silas in the lead, Thorne and Pike flanking him, their rifles held ready. They were moving with a desperate, unified purpose, no longer tentative. They were coming as a wave, a formidable force against a single woman. Their footsteps, heavy and deliberate, kicked up small clouds of dust that shimmered in the midday sun. The air grew thick with their anticipation, their primal intent. Alara slipped back from her vantage point, moving silently through the dry scrub brush. She did not aim for the cabin. Her strategy had shifted. She would draw them in, lure them into her trap, a place where her knowledge of the land and her unique skills would give her an undeniable advantage. She was no longer just defending. She was attacking. She moved towards the cluster of ancient cottonwood trees that marked the dry creek bed, a short distance from the cabin. It was a treacherous area, full of hidden dips and slippery, sun-baked clay. It was also the closest way to approach the cabin unseen, a path they would undoubtedly take in their rush. She moved with the silent grace of a desert predator, her breath shallow, her heart a steady drum. The final confrontation was at hand, and Alara, the silent widow, was ready to become the reaper. The dry creek bed, a serpentine scar across the sun-baked earth, was Alara's chosen battleground. Its banks, lined with twisted roots and crumbling earth, offered both concealment and treacherous footing. The air shimmered with the heat, creating a mirage that danced above the stones, blurring the edges of reality. She remembered Nantan's voice, low and resonant, speaking of the shaman's teachings, not of magic, but of the profound connection between warrior and land. "The desert does not fight for you, child," he would say, his eyes piercing. "It provides, it offers, but you must know how to ask." This cultural belief, prevalent among many Apache groups, spoke of a reciprocal relationship with nature where understanding and respect for the environment were paramount to survival. One lesson in particular echoed in her mind, the teaching of the stillness of the hunter. Nantan had taken her to a watering hole, hidden deep within a canyon, and made her sit for hours, unmoving, unseen by the thirsty animals that came to drink. "Do not seek the deer, child," he had whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air. "Become the shadow that waits. Let the deer come to you." This was not about passive waiting, but active stillness, a heightened state of awareness where every rustle, every scent, every shift in air currents became a signal. The patience, the absolute control over one's own presence was key. This patience was now her sharpest weapon. Silas and his remaining ruffians, Thorn and Pike, were approaching the creek bed, their movements increasingly cautious, their rifles held high. They were looking for her, but they were looking for a conventional threat, a figure they could aim at, a target that moved predictably. They did not expect the land itself to rise against them. Alara melted into the gnarled roots of a particularly ancient cottonwood, its bark rough against her skin, its shade a welcome reprieve from the relentless sun. Her breath was shallow, her heart beating a steady, silent rhythm against her ribs. She could hear their heavy boots crunching on the dry creek bed, the ragged rasp of their breathing, the faint clink of metal against leather. They were close, too close for their own good. Silas, ever the leader, stopped suddenly. "Hold up!" he growled, his voice tight with suspicion. "Something ain't right." He scanned the sparse tree line, his eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of movement. He was smart enough to know they were being drawn into something, but his greed and arrogance blinded him to the true nature of his opponent. His moral conflict was simmering, the primal instinct for self-preservation warring with the unyielding drive for the rumored gold. Thorn, the more nervous of the two, shifted his weight. "Jed and Miller ain't moving," he muttered, his voice a low, fearful tremor. "And that woman, she ain't just an old widow." "Oh, she's alone, I tell you," Pike scoffed, though his own voice lacked conviction. "Just got some tricks up her sleeve. We push through, we get the gold, and this is all over." Pike, blinded by his own simple-minded aggression, was the most dangerous and potentially the easiest to outwit. Silas, still uneasy, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the dense tangle of roots and deadfall that marked the beginning of the creek bed. "Fan out," he ordered, "but stay tight. If she shows herself, don't hesitate." Alara heard them spread out, their footsteps now more deliberate, more hesitant. They were entering her trap, their formation breaking, their focus divided. She was not just waiting, she was observing, calculating. She knew the dry creek bed held patches of loose, unstable gravel, places where a man's foot would slip, sending him stumbling. She knew where the sun baked the clay into a slick, treacherous surface, and she knew where the shadows lay deepest, providing perfect concealment. Her hand, still gripping the knife, was steady. This was the stillness Nantan had taught her, the stillness that preceded the storm. She was a part of the creek bed, a silent, invisible force. She did not need to run, did not need to hide. She merely needed to wait for them to make their move, to commit to her chosen ground. The cultural myth of the unconquerable wilderness often portrayed the American frontier as a force that broke men, a place where only the strongest or the most cunning survived. Alara, in her quiet defiance, embodied this myth. She was not fighting the wilderness. She was fighting with it. an extension of its brutal, beautiful indifference. The air, thick with the scent of dust and tension, pressed down on her, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. She was a silent observer, poised, ready to strike, when the moment ripened. A twig snapped with a sharp crack, betraying Thorne's position as he tried to navigate the treacherous creek bed. His footing unsure on the loose gravel, he cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated growl. Silas, a few paces ahead, halted, his head cocked, listening. Alara felt a ripple of grim satisfaction. They were falling into her design, their impatience and unfamiliarity with the terrain becoming their undoing. This was the trap Nuntan had spoken of, not a physical snare, but a psychological one. Exploiting the enemy's assumptions and weaknesses, she thought of the Wakan, the sacred power or mystery that some Lakota tribes believed resided in natural elements, a spiritual force that could be harnessed by those attuned to it. While Alara didn't ascribe to literal magic, she understood the profound power of using the land itself as an ally, transforming its natural features into a defensive maze. Her homestead, a place of peace, was now a labyrinth of peril. Silas, his instincts sharpened by years of violence, sensed the unseen presence, though he couldn't pinpoint it. "Quiet, you fool," he hissed at Thorne, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She's out here. She's watching." He scanned the sparse trees, his eyes narrowed, looking for a shadow that didn't belong. He was a predator, but in this moment, he was also prey, his confidence steadily eroding. Alara waited, perfectly still, a part of the gnarled roots and sun-baked earth. She could hear Pike's heavy breathing, closer now, as he moved along the opposite bank of the creek bed, trying to maintain a wide, cautious perimeter. He was relying on brute force and sheer numbers, convinced that if they simply kept pushing, they would overwhelm the unseen threat. This simple-minded approach was both his strength and his greatest vulnerability. Her eyes, sharp and clear, found Pike. He was struggling with a small, steep incline, his heavy boots slipping on the dry clay. He paused, bracing himself against a thorny bush, his rifle held awkwardly as he fought for balance. This was the moment. He was exposed, off balance, and his attention was divided. Alara moved, not towards Pike, but away from him, deeper into the cover of the cottonwoods. She found a small, flat stone, smooth and heavy, and tossed it with practiced ease. It landed with a faint splash in the nearly dry creek bed, a short distance behind Pike. The sound, subtle but distinct, caused Pike to flinch violently. His head snapped around, his rifle swinging wildly in the direction of the sound. "What was that?" he bellowed, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and bravado. He fired a wild shot into the brush, the rifle's roar echoing deafeningly in the confines of the creek bed. The sound was a harsh, jarring note in the quiet, and it drew Silas and Thorne's attention away from Alara's true position, momentarily disorienting them. Pike, still agitated, stepped back, his foot landing on a patch of loose shale. He yelped as he lost his footing, tumbling backward down the small incline, landing with a grunt in a shallow pool of muddy water. His rifle clattered away, sliding into the murky depths. He thrashed, trying to get up, his thick frame clumsy and unbalanced. Silas and Thorne rushed towards Pike, their faces etched with frustration and a growing sense of dread. "Pike, you imbecile!" Silas roared, scrambling down the bank to help him. Their formation was broken, their focus diverted, just as Alara had intended. They were clustered now, vulnerable, trapped in the confines of the creek bed. Alara emerged from the cottonwoods, moving with silent purpose. She did not raise the rifle she carried. Its purpose had been served, to sow doubt and to draw them into her chosen ground. Now she would rely on the silent, intimate weapon that was an extension of her very being. The creek bed, once a sanctuary of quiet beauty, was now a theater of their undoing. Her eyes met Silas's. His face, grimed with dust and sweat, showed a flicker of stark realization as he finally saw her, standing calmly above them, the knife in her hand glinting in the midday sun. It wasn't the image of a cowering widow he had expected. It was the image of a silent, implacable avenger. The moral conflict for Silas was no longer about gold, but about survival. For Alara, there was no conflict left, only the cold, clear purpose of the hunt. The midday sun, now a malevolent eye in the vast expanse of the sky, cast no shadows long enough to conceal the final reckoning unfolding in the dry creek bed. Silas, his face etched with a dawning horror, finally saw Alara. Not as a cowering victim, but as the apex predator she truly was. The glint of the knife in her hand was not just metal reflecting light. It was a cold, hard promise. Thorn and Pike, still scrambling from their respective mishaps, looked up, their eyes widening in disbelief as they registered the silent, implacable figure standing above them. "The widow!" Silas rasped, his voice a guttural sound, laced with a fear he hadn't known in years. His face, usually a mask of hardened indifference, now contorted into something akin to genuine terror. He had stalked many a victim, but never had he been so thoroughly outmaneuvered, so cunningly lured into a trap. His experience, his reputation, everything he believed about his own prowess was crumbling under the silent gaze of this woman. This internal conflict, the shattering of his self-perception, was a far more profound blow than any physical injury. Alara didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on Silas, her mind already anticipating his desperate move. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. She knew he would reach for his gun, a Colt single-action army, iconic for its reliability in the American West, holstered low on his hip. It was a fast draw, but Alara had faced faster, in a different life, under a different sun. "Get her!" Silas roared, his voice a desperate, primal bellow, as he simultaneously lunged for his revolver. Thorn, still favoring his twisted ankle, tried to raise his rifle, but his movements were clumsy, hampered by pain and confusion. Pike, still in the muddy pool, thrashed uselessly, his own rifle lost. Alara moved, not towards Silas, but slightly to her right, putting Thorn directly between her and the leader's line of fire. It was a calculated risk, a maneuver honed by years of Apache training where a warrior understood how to use the environment, and even the enemy, as a shield. The knife was a blur in her hand. Thorn, in his desperate attempt to steady his rifle, became her unwitting pawn. Her blade found his leg. A swift, decisive cut to the femoral artery. He cried out, a strangled gurgle as his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, a heavy sack of bones, directly into Silas's path. Silas, mid-draw, stumbled over Thorn's falling body. The precious seconds of his draw were lost. Before he could regain his footing, before his hand could even fully clear leather, Alara was on him. She did not hesitate. The knife, an extension of her will, found its mark. A deep, precise thrust to the chest. Silas gasped, a single choked sound, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The color drained from his face as his hand, still clutching the grip of his unfired revolver, slowly lost its strength. He crumpled, his body falling heavily onto the dry creek bed, his gaze fixed on the endless blue sky, then flickering and finally still. The cultural myth of the quick draw and the honorable gunfight was shattered by the brutal, silent efficiency of a woman and her blade. Pike, still struggling in the mud, watched the scene unfold, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. He had seen men die, but never like this, never with such silent, brutal grace. He was paralyzed, not by his physical predicament, but by the sheer, overwhelming dread of the woman who now stood over him. Alara turned to Pike, her face impassive, her eyes reflecting the cold, hard light of the desert. He whimpered, a low, pathetic sound like a trapped animal. He tried to scramble away, pushing himself deeper into the muddy water, but his injured leg in the slick clay betrayed him. "You came here to take what wasn't yours," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through the silent gulch. "This land gives, and this land takes. And today, it took from you." The moral conflict, for her, was utterly resolved. These men had chosen violence, and she had simply responded in kind, fulfilling a grim, necessary purpose. She had become the instrument of the land's justice. She did not touch him. She simply stood over him, the blade still in her hand, allowing the full weight of his fear to settle upon him. He was broken, not just physically, but spiritually. He was no longer a threat. She had stripped him of his will, his arrogance, and his ability to harm. The sun beat down, casting long, still shadows over the fallen men. The only sounds now were Pike's ragged breathing and the faint, persistent buzzing of flies, drawn by the scent of blood. The long, silent struggle was over, and the silent widow had emerged victorious, stained by the dust and blood of her triumph. The silence that descended upon the dry creek bed was not the peaceful hush of the desert, but a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with the aftermath of violence. The midday sun, once a source of blinding light, now seemed to press down with an almost physical weight, intensifying the grim tableau. Alara stood motionless, the knife still clutched in her hand, its blade a testament to the brutal efficiency of her defense. The dust, disturbed by the brief, furious struggle, slowly settled back onto the earth, coating everything in a fine, reddish-brown film. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, not from exertion, but from the emotional release that followed the fight. The adrenaline, which had surged through her veins like a torrent, now began to recede, leaving her limbs heavy, her muscles aching with a profound weariness. The scent of blood, sharp and metallic, mingled with the dry, earthy smell of the desert, a primal combination that stirred dormant memories within her. Silas lay still, a dark, crumpled shape against the pale stones. Thorn, his life ebbing with the steady drip of blood onto the thirsty ground, made a faint, gurgling sound. Pike, still trapped in the muddy pool, stared up at Alara, his eyes wide, reflecting a terror so profound it seemed to drain the color from his face. He was broken, utterly defeated, not just physically, but in spirit. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had stumbled into a force beyond his comprehension, a woman who defied every expectation of a helpless widow. Alara's gaze swept over the scene, registering every detail with a detached clarity. The discarded rifles, their metallic sheen dulled by dust, lay scattered like forgotten toys. The overturned stones, the scuffed earth, the faint, shimmering heat haze. Each element spoke of the brutal, swift exchange that had just taken place. She felt no triumph, no exhilaration, only a deep, abiding sense of weariness and a chilling understanding of the cost of survival. The moral conflict that had raged within her was now settled, replaced by the grim reality of her choices. She had chosen to live, and others had died because of it. She walked slowly towards Thorn, the man she had cut. He was fading fast, his breath rattling in his throat. His eyes, though clouded, held a flicker of something akin to regret, perhaps even a silent question. She knelt beside him, not out of compassion, but out of a need for closure. a final confirmation. There was no life left in him. Then she moved to Pike. He flinched as she approached, trying to pull himself deeper into the mud, his whimpers growing louder. His terror was palpable, a foul stench in the air. Alara looked at him, her eyes cold, devoid of sympathy. He had come to rob, to violate, to destroy. He had chosen this path. She removed the gag, letting him taste the dust and the bitter tang of his own fear. "You speak," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "Tell me what else you sought. What rumors brought you here?" Pike coughed, spitting out a mouthful of mud. "Gold!" he croaked, his voice raw with fear. "Always gold. Heard tell? Your man found a seam. Kept it hidden. We just wanted our share." His words were broken, desperate, a pathetic attempt to justify their actions. Alara's gaze hardened. "My husband sought no gold," she said, her voice chillingly quiet. "He sought peace. And you trampled it underfoot." The cultural myth of hidden riches in the West was a powerful one, drawing countless individuals to their fortunes or their doom. But for Alara, it was a baseless fantasy that had brought only destruction. She picked up Silas's fallen revolver, its heavy weight familiar in her hand. She checked its chambers. Full. She looked back at Pike, his eyes wide with desperate pleading. Her mind wrestled with a lingering moral question: to show mercy or to ensure that no further threat remained. Thomas would have advocated for mercy, for a chance at redemption. But Nantan would have taught her to eliminate all threats, to leave no loose ends. The choice hung heavy in the air, a final test of her resolved spirit. A faint buzz, louder than the flies, reached her ears. More flies, a growing swarm. They were gathering, drawn by the fresh blood, a grim symbol of the death that now permeated the air. The desert, unforgiving and indifferent, was already beginning its work of reclamation. Alara slowly raised the revolver, its barrel glinting in the sun. Pike whimpered again, closing his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. The silent widow, now a silent executioner, made her final decision. This land had taken what it was owed, and she would ensure it collected the last debt. The sharp crack of the revolver, though expected, still ripped through the air with a brutal finality, scattering the nascent swarm of flies and sending a lone raven spiraling upwards from its perch on a distant mesa. The sound was stark, uncompromising, a grim punctuation mark to the violence that had engulfed Alara's homestead. Pike's body slumped, his eyes, once wide with terror, now staring vacantly at the indifferent sky. His last breath was a silent exhalation of fear, a testament to the deadly will of the woman who stood over him. The decision had been made, and the consequence met. Alara felt no elation, no sense of triumph, only a profound, aching emptiness that settled deep in her bones. The adrenaline was now completely gone, replaced by a crushing weariness that threatened to buckle her knees. She had done what was necessary, what the land had demanded, what her forgotten training had prepared her for, but the cost was heavy, etched onto her soul. The cultural belief of the bloody shirt in the American West, where violence often begot more violence, was a cycle she understood intimately, and one she now found herself caught in. The immediate aftermath was a gruesome tableau. 3 men lay dead in the creek bed, their bodies already beginning to surrender to the unforgiving heat. Jed, the first to fall, lay where she had left him, his wounds a silent testament to her precision. Thorne, bleeding out, had found his end in the dust, his face a mask of bewildered pain. And now Pike, finally silenced, his fear extinguished by the swift hand of justice. Silas, the leader, lay closest to her, his open eyes reflecting the limitless blue. Her first task was the grim ritual of burial, To leave the bodies exposed would attract scavengers, coyotes, vultures, and eventually other men. The desert was a harsh mistress, but it also demanded respect, even for the fallen. She retrieved their rifles, carefully checking each one for ammunition before stacking them near the cottonwood, a silent collection of vanquished power. The sidearms she left holstered on the dead men, a macabre symbol of their defeat. She began to dig. The earth was hard, compacted by years of sun and infrequent rain, and the work was arduous. She used a short-handled shovel from her cabin, its blade ringing against the scattered rocks. Each scoop of earth was a heavy burden, a physical manifestation of the moral weight she carried. She was not a grave digger, but a woman forced by circumstance to perform the grim task of burying the consequences of other men's greed. As she worked, memories flickered through her mind, fragments of her life with Thomas, his gentle voice, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of the land and the people who lived on it. He would have been horrified by this scene, by the violence and the death. He believed in building, in cultivating, in nurturing life. She, however, had been forced to destroy, to take. The conflict between the life she had chosen and the life she had been forced back into was a raw wound, festering in her soul. She thought of the traditional Apache burial rites, of wrapping the deceased in blankets, placing their personal effects with them, and then burying them in a sacred place, often marked by a simple cairn of stones. It was a ritual of respect, of sending the spirit on its journey. These men, however, would receive no such honor. They would be buried simply, efficiently, without ceremony, beneath the dry, indifferent earth. The sun beat down relentlessly, making the air shimmer above the creek bed. Sweat plastered strands of hair to Alara's forehead, mingling with the dust that clung to her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain, driven by a grim determination. She moved the heavy bodies one by one, dragging them into the shallow graves she had painstakingly dug. The sheer physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the echoing silence in her mind. As she covered the last man, Silas, she paused, her shovel resting against the fresh mound of earth. His revolver, still in its holster, was now covered by a thin layer of dust. The last vestiges of his ambition, his greed, were now buried beneath the soil of the land he had sought to conquer. A slow, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. The land had absorbed their violence, and now it absorbed their bodies. The ledger was balanced, the debt paid, but the silence that followed was not truly empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the fallen, and with the chilling realization that peace, once shattered, was never truly regained. The silent widow had defended her home, but she had also rediscovered a part of herself she had long buried, a part that carried the chill of the blade and the grim knowledge of survival. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the newly disturbed earth, a silent testament to the reckoning that had occurred at dawn. The setting sun, a bruised purple and fiery orange bruise on the western horizon, painted the mesa in hues of melancholy and finality. The air, once thick with the acrid scent of conflict, now carried only the dry perfume of sage and dust, a fragile peace that felt utterly undeserved. Alara stood by the small cairn of stones that marked Thomas's grave, her gaze sweeping over the landscape, a vast, indifferent canvas that had witnessed her unraveling and rebirth. The new mounds of earth, raw and untamed, were stark blemishes on the otherwise unbroken expanse, grim reminders of the price she had paid for solitude. She had buried them deep, out of sight, a final, necessary act of concealment. The rifles and the other tools of war they had brought were likewise hidden, tucked into crevices and under rocks, awaiting the slow, inevitable reclamation by the desert. Her hands, rough and aching, still felt the vibration of the shovel, the cool touch of the earth. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that settled into her very soul, but beneath it, a quiet strength had begun to stir, like a seed pushing through hardened soil. The moral conflict that had once tormented her, the struggle between the gentle widow and the ruthless warrior, had, in its resolution, forged something new. She was no longer simply Alara, Thomas's wife, nor was she merely the Apache-trained fighter. She was both, inextricably linked, a complex weave of grief and resilience, peace and violence. The frontier, with its harsh demands, often forced such brutal transformations, blurring the lines between what one was and what one had to be. This was the unforgiving reality that many settlers faced, a life where survival often meant shedding societal conventions. She thought of the tales Thomas used to tell, stories of homesteaders who endured impossible hardships, of families who built lives from nothing but grit and determination. He had admired their spirit, their stubborn refusal to be broken. He would have seen her fight as a testament to that same unyielding will, perhaps even a justification for the brutal choices she'd made. But she knew, in her heart, that his gentle soul would have recoiled from the bloodshed. It was a lingering paradox, a wound that would likely never fully heal. Old Jack, her scruffy border collie, emerged from the cabin, nudging her hand with his wet nose, a soft whine escaping his throat. He sensed her quiet distress, the profound weight that clung to her. She knelt, burying her face in his fur, finding a fragile comfort in his unwavering loyalty. He was a creature of simple needs, of unburdened affections, a stark contrast to the complex, violent world she had just navigated. The cabin, too, carried the scars of the day. The splintered door hung loosely on its hinges, a gaping wound. Inside, the meager furnishings were overturned, a testament to the ruffians' frustrated search for the gold that didn't exist. It would take time to repair, to restore the order that had once defined her life here. But as she looked at it, she saw not just destruction, but a challenge. She had defended it once. She would rebuild it now. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of her resilience, her defiant presence in a land that sought to test her at every turn. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed across the darkening plains. It was a familiar sound, one she had grown accustomed to in her years of solitude, a constant reminder of the wild, untamed nature of the land. Now, however, it seemed to carry a new meaning, a lament for the lives lost, a quiet acknowledgement of the brutal exchange that had taken place. She turned from Thomas's grave, her gaze sweeping across the vast horizon. The future was an unwritten page, stark and uncertain. She had driven away the immediate threat, but the desert was still a place of hidden dangers, of desperate men and unseen challenges. The silent widow was no longer just a figure of quiet grief. She was a woman marked by fire and steel, forever changed by the events of this single brutal day. The peace she had sought with Thomas was gone, replaced by a harder, more vigilant existence. She was a survivor, but she was also a warrior, and the frontier had made sure she would never forget it. The sun, now a dying ember on the distant peaks, cast long, distorted shadows across the mesa, blurring the lines between reality and the nascent legends that began to take root. News like wildfire in dry grass traveled fast across the frontier, carried by lone riders, by dusty stagecoaches, by the whispered tales around flickering campfires. The story of the silent widow and the dead ruffians began its slow, inevitable transformation from grim fact into frontier folklore. It began with a trapper, weeks later, finding Jed's bound accomplice, Pike, still whimpering, still crippled in the muddy gulch, a broken man left for dead. He was found by a lone trapper, a grizzled old man named Silas Crandall, who rarely ventured near settlements, preferring the company of the wild. Crandall, a man of few words, heard Pike's rambling, fear-addled tale of the demon woman and her ghost blade, a story so wild and terrifying it defied rational explanation. He spoke of the meticulous way she had incapacitated 2 men and then killed the others with a chilling, almost supernatural precision. He swore the devil himself had trained her. This was how the legend took root, twisting the brutal facts into something more palatable for the superstitious minds of the West. The common belief in the frontier often included tales of strange occurrences, of hauntings, of unexplainable events in the vast, untamed wilderness. For many, the idea of a lone woman capable of such a feat was simply too unsettling to accept without a supernatural explanation. The silent widow of the mesa became a cautionary tale, whispered among prospectors and cowboys, a warning against venturing too close to the haunted homestead. The story spread, gaining new layers with each retelling. Some said she was a witch, capable of conjuring storms and turning men to stone. Others claimed she was the avenging spirit of the land itself, protecting its ancient secrets from the greedy hands of man. There were whispers of Apache spirits guiding her blade, of phantom warriors fighting by her side. The actual historical detail of Apache scouts, often being employed by the U.S. Army, feared for their tracking and fighting skills, ironically, lent a strange credibility to the fantastical elements of the widow's tale. Alara, unaware of the burgeoning legend, slowly began to rebuild her life. The cabin, with its splintered door, became a project, a physical manifestation of her healing. She replaced the shattered wood, her hands calloused but strong. She meticulously cleaned the cabin, removing every trace of the intrusion, scrubbing away the grime and the phantom scent of fear. Old Jack, her loyal companion, watched her with quiet understanding, his presence a comforting anchor in her solitary world. Yet despite her efforts, the peace she once knew was irrevocably altered. The landscape, once a comforting solitude, now felt charged with the echoes of violence. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl carried a new weight, a memory of the day she had become a killer. The moral conflict, though resolved, had left its indelible mark. She had survived, but at what cost to her soul? Could she ever truly shed the skin of the warrior, or was she destined to carry the blade, even when it lay hidden? She sometimes caught herself reaching for the knife, a phantom weight in her hand, even when there was no threat. The old instincts, long dormant, had been reawakened, and they hummed beneath her skin, a constant, unsettling reminder of her past. She would spend hours gazing at the horizon, her eyes scanning the distant trails, no longer just for the beauty of the landscape, but for the subtle signs of approaching danger. Her solitude, once a balm, had become a perpetual vigil. The legend of the silent widow grew, reaching towns hundreds of miles away, adding a new thread to the rich tapestry of Western folklore. Men who once scoffed at such tales found themselves looking over their shoulders, their bravado tempered by a healthy dose of superstition. The deserted homestead, once a target, was now avoided, shrouded in an aura of fear and mystery. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter in the legend of the woman who had dared to stand alone against the tide of avarice and violence. The wind, a constant mournful companion on the mesa, whispered through the newly mended cabin, carrying with it the ghost of a different life. Alara, no longer bound by the rigid routines of a peace she had fought so hard to maintain, found herself restless. The land, once her sanctuary, now felt too small, too filled with the echoes of violence. The graves in the creek bed, though hidden, were a constant, silent presence, anchoring her to a past she could not fully escape. She had rebuilt the cabin, but the internal landscape of her soul remained irrevocably altered. One morning, just as the first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky, Alara stood by the open doorway of her cabin. Old Jack lay curled at her feet, a silent sentinel. Her gaze swept across the familiar landscape, the distant San Juan Mountains, perpetually blue, the low scrub brush, tenacious in its hold on the parched earth, the winding creek bed, now a place of grim memory. The sense of confinement, of being trapped by her own survival, grew overwhelming. She thought of the nomadic lifestyle of the Apache, a profound contrast to the settlers' desire to stake a permanent claim. This cultural difference resonated with her now, the call of the open land becoming too strong to ignore. She packed simply, with the efficiency born of necessity and a lifetime of self-reliance. A saddlebag filled with dried jerky, a tin of coffee, a few blankets, and the Winchester rifle. The hunting knife, the one that had served her so brutally well, was strapped to her thigh, a silent, comforting weight. She left behind almost everything else, the few personal effects, the remnants of Thomas's life, a silent farewell to the woman she had been. The moral conflict of abandoning her home, the last tangible link to Thomas, was profound, but the need for self-preservation, for a different kind of peace, was stronger. Old Jack whined softly, sensing the shift in her intentions. She knelt, stroking his head. "Come on, old friend," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "Time to ride." He nudged her hand, then rose, his tail wagging faintly, ready to follow wherever she led. His loyalty was a pure, uncomplicated thing, a stark contrast to the complexities of human greed and violence she had just faced. She mounted her mare, a sturdy, unassuming animal named Willow. The horse shifted beneath her, accustomed to long journeys. Alara took one last look at the cabin, its mended door a silent testament to her struggle. It stood alone, a small, defiant outpost against the vastness, waiting for the desert to claim it, or for new inhabitants to find it. As she rode away, heading west, towards the setting sun and the uncharted territories beyond, she left no discernible trail. The fine, dried dust of the mesa, so eager to conceal, rose briefly under Willow's hooves, then settled back into place, erasing her tracks. She moved with the silent grace of a phantom, a whisper on the wind, leaving behind only the burgeoning legend of the silent widow of the mesa. The men who had come for gold had found only death, and the woman they had underestimated had vanished, subsumed by the very land she had defended. Some say she joined the band of renegade Apache, finding a new kind of family among the people who had raised her. Others claim she became a solitary wanderer, a guardian spirit of the wild places, striking down those who desecrated the land or preyed upon the innocent. The truth, like so many stories of the Old West, faded into the dust and the winds, becoming a part of the vast, untamed landscape she now inhabited. She was no longer a widow, no longer simply a warrior. She was a legend, a ripple in the fabric of the frontier, a woman who had faced the darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but forever a part of the wild, silent heart of the West. The last embers of the sun surrendered to the encroaching night, bleeding across the vast western sky in streaks of tired orange and deep bruised indigo. The mesa,
now swallowed by shadow, stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. A lone coyote howled, a mournful, drawn-out cry that spoke of profound emptiness, not just of the land, but of the human heart, that sought solace within its boundless embrace. The wind, which had carried whispers of violence and survival throughout the day, now softened to a gentle sigh, rustling through the sagebrush like a collective breath, held and released.
The cabin, small and isolated, was a dark silhouette against the fading light, its mended door a silent sentinel. No smoke curled from its chimney, no lamplight flickered from its windows. It was an empty vessel, a monument to a life once lived, a battle hard won, and a departure made in the quietude of resolve. The air grew cooler, carrying the crisp scent of night-blooming cereus and the faint, lingering metallic tang that only the desert could hold. The stars, one by one, began to prick through the deepening blue, vast and indifferent, bearing witness to stories untold and paths unfollowed. She was gone, like a fleeting shadow, like boot prints on a trail no one walks anymore. The desert, unforgiving and all-consuming, had taken her back, not in defeat, but in quiet triumph. Would you have chosen differently if it was your hand on the blade, your peace at stake, and your past whispering its brutal truths in the face of insurmountable odds? The silence that stretched across the mesa was the only answer, a profound, lingering question echoing through the vast, empty heart of the American frontier.